Good lunch, everybody. It's my pleasure to have Yisong here from Caltech, who's done a lot of work in exploring, which he will tell us about today. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to this amazing workshop. Today I'll be talking about explorations of exploration, deep learning meets value of information in sequential experimental design. In honor of this workshop, this is actually the very first time I have prepared and given this talk. So what that means is, number one, I'm super excited and super nervous. And so if people have feedback on how the talk can be better, or even directions and advice on which how to take this research, I'd be delighted to talk to you and hear from you. So the setting of this talk is on goal-oriented experiment design. What that means is on the left-hand side, you have an experiment designer, typically a domain expert like a scientist, increasingly automated or semi-automated as we increase the scope and scale of the experimentation. On the right-hand side, you see a collection of different types of experimental platforms that are becoming increasingly more automatable. And so what happens is the experiment designer chooses an experiment, and this is, of course, an oversimplified cartoon depiction of what actually happens, because the screening process and the stochasticity of the synthesis process is often very complicated, but for the purposes of a computer scientist, here's sort of the cartoon depiction. After you run the experiment, you receive a measurement. And then the experiment designer takes this measurement, looks at the previous measurements they've made, does some reasoning, and then chooses the next experiment, and this process continues. This process is iterative and adaptive in that the experiment designer chooses the next experiment based on the outcomes of the previous ones. And it's also utility maximizing in the sense that the goal is to find some notion of a best outcome. Let's just use this. Notion of a best outcome, because we don't have time to explore the whole space of possible experiments. So we really want to achieve our goal. And there are many applications that fall under this broad category, from things like tuning robotic controllers to drug discovery to materials design and so on and so forth. As we start to think about how to apply these ideas to real-world applications, a number of challenges arise. So one is the fact that in many real-world applications, you have very volatile utility landscapes. Things that look good from one configuration of your experiment design might suddenly look terrible with a slight deviation of that parameterization. You have high dimensionality. When you're working in real-world problems, you're typically faced with very high dimensional design spaces, and navigating that can be challenging. You have distribution shift. Oftentimes, when we want to do new designs and new experiments and new science, the data that we want to collect is necessarily, almost by definition, outside of the distribution of the previous data we collected. Otherwise, we're not really making a discovery. And so if we want to use historical data to help us better make decisions when designing new experiments for a new experimental domain, we have to account for distribution shift. The experiment designs can be multi-objective. Here's an collaboration I have at Caltech where people are designing controllers for lower body powered exoskeletons to help paralyzed subjects regain some lower limb mobility. As you can imagine, there are many parameters and objectives that one needs to account for in designing these controllers, and they have to be done via experimentation on the subjects. Just two that are obvious are things like efficacy and comfort versus safety. And finally, you have things like imperfect and heterogeneous experiments. Here's an example from a collaboration I had on nanophotonics, where you can simulate, for example, Maxwell's equations at different resolutions in both spatial and temporal. And the low fidelity ones are, of course, much faster and much cheaper, but their measurements are biased in very sort of nonlinear ways. So a lot of this talk will be motivated by ongoing collaborations in protein engineering. And so here you have a design task. We want to design a protein to achieve a certain function. The design task is out of distribution in the sense that it's not in the trading distribution. And what you might consider doing these days is do some form of representation learning, possibly multimodal, based on prior experiments, simulation data, mining research papers, putting in symbolic domain knowledge, such as those derived from physics. And you take these two, you do some sort of uncertainty quantification, because we don't actually know how to design a protein to solve this task. From this uncertainty quantification, we have an algorithm that chooses what we think is the most informative experiment. We run that experiment. We populate our data set, we perhaps update our representations, we do this cycle all over again until we converge to the best possible protein design within our experimental budget. Now, of course, there are things like batch and heterogeneous experiments. For example, you can do wet lab, you can do large-scale computational experiments, such as using Rosetta, and they're typically done in parallel. And so now we have to sort of design experiments, to come up with an algorithm that can sort of manage all these heterogeneous and parallelized assets. And then, of course, the actual result here is just for a fairly isolated objective. And if you make progress, you have to then move on to a more complex objective with more constraints. And then you do a sort of a version of this process all over again, and then maybe it doesn't work, and you go back to the drawing board at the top with a modified objective that's a proxy for the downstream objective, and this whole process continues. So this is, even this is a dramatic oversimplification of a real-world application. And so the basic recipe, if you start to think about how to design algorithms that can automate some scoped subset of what I just described in the previous slide, so here's the basic recipe. You choose an objective, could be more than one, that captures sort of what you think is the most important thing you want to optimize for in this part of the scope of the project. You choose your experimental platforms, could be computational, could be wet lab, could be a combination of the two. You choose your representation of the data. These days, of course, there's a lot of interest in using deep learning to build sort of these learned representations of the phenomenon. You choose your algorithm that actually takes all of the above and then designs a policy that can choose what experiment to run next. And of course, all four of these things are interdependent with each other. The objective function, whether it's very volatile or smooth, will influence your choice of algorithm. Your choice of experimental platform will influence your choice of algorithm. Your choice of representation will influence your choice of algorithm. And so we're going to spend this talk sort of looking at a few different ways to think about how to sort of actually instantiate this recipe in a few different contexts. One of the motivating applications is work led by Jason Yang, who is a PhD student co-advised by myself and Francis Arnold. Jason is here today, and he'll be also presenting later this week. And it's on engineering an active site of our protoglobin to select for the cis product over the trans product. And if you have any questions about the application, don't ask me, ask Jason, who is a biochemist and computational person now by training. It's a very large design space. There's about 3.2 million variants of possible protein designs, and we are collaborating with Allogen to actually synthesize these proteins in the wet lab. Another example that is an active collaboration with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories is on large-scale computational antibody design. And this is really the actual overall project is spearheaded by Tom Desautels, who is also here. And the basic idea is that we have a large batch of computational workers, and we want to design some kind of policy in our orchestrator algorithm that can manage all these assets, and then the output is a diverse portfolio of antibodies that is robust against a set of downstream requirements that we cannot model exactly. An orchestrator? Yeah. It's a fancy computer science term for, we used to call it a master, but that became like politically incorrect. This is recorded. It's basically an algorithm that tells the other algorithms what to do. Yeah. So the type of research questions that I like to study while we think about these applications and these settings are things like, how do we design scalable algorithms in a principled way? How do we quantify uncertainty in these complex and high-dimensional settings in a principled way? How do we design methods that can cover in a holistic way, cover a larger scope of that overall design pipeline, of which in classic algorithms often only cover a tiny scope? So how do we cover a larger scope? And of course, making progress with all of that, how do we move towards full stack algorithmic experiment design, of which exploration is sort of the key idea that these algorithms need to be able to implement smartly in order to do efficient experiment design. And of course, Jennifer Liskard is also going to talk about a lot of this related stuff. Her talk's on Friday. You should not miss it. And as I mentioned before, this is a work in progress, so advice is very welcome. And so here's just a thought experiment to get us all on the same page. I know that this is a very diverse audience, and not everyone has experience in active learning and Bayesian optimization, so this is sort of just a very simple thought experiment. Suppose we had a one-dimensional design space. That's the x-axis. So all the possible designs of our experiments are, some number along this 1D axis. That's how it's parameterized. The y-axis is the utility function. And we've made in this example 4 measurements. Those are these four black points. And we're going to be Bayesian in this example. And so we have, after making those 4 observations, we have a posterior distribution of what we think the true utility function is. And what I'm visualizing here is the posterior mean. That's the solid red line. And the shaded region with the 2 upper and lower red lines is sort of a 95% confidence interval, if you will. We can also, if we're truly Bayesian, we can also draw a sample from this posterior distribution of what a possible utility function might look like, and that's the dotted red line, okay? And so the question is, of course, given that we've collected these 4 experiments so far, we want to find the point that has the highest utility. If we were to design an algorithm that actually can sort of select the next experiments by itself, we need a policy for that algorithm. And so the key question is, what should we choose next? Which point in this 1D space should we choose next? We can choose the point with the highest posterior mean. That's the point in the 1D space that intersects that vertical red line. We can choose the point that has the highest uncertainty. This is the highest sort of distance between the upper and lower confidence bounds. That's the point, that's the green point. We can choose the point that has the highest optimistic estimate. That's where the upper confidence bound, that top red line, is maximized. We can choose the point that has the highest value according to our random sample. That's the purple point. And all these different choices have different characteristics. And which one works well depends on this notion called the value of information. The informal definition of the value of information is how much information in expectation any given measurement might tell us about our desired goal. Now, we haven't made the measurement yet. It's a proposed measurement. And a desired goal is task dependent. It can be the best solution. It can be some Pareto frontier if it's multi-objective. It can be the most accurate model if I actually want to build the most accurate model. And a decision policy in this case, under this type of design paradigm, is simply going to choose the experiment to observe a measurement from with the highest value of information, assuming we have a way of quantifying it. And please feel free to ask any questions if you have any during the talk. And so let's come back to this example where we have these 4 choices. We could, all of these 4 correspond to a way of quantifying the value of information. Right, highest uncertainty, the way you quantify it is you look at the size of the confidence interval. Right, that's a quantification of the value of information. Highest posterior mean, again, you just look at the point with the posterior mean that has the highest value. All of these things can directly translate to a way of quantifying the value of information, which means you can implement it in an automated algorithm. Now, the posterior mean, unfortunately, we won't actually learn that much in terms of value information because it's the one that on average we think is the best, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about how much we'll learn if we actually observe a new measurement there. Highest uncertainty, we might learn a lot because it's the point in the design space with the highest spread in terms of possible outcomes. Unfortunately, it can be the case, and it often is the case, that the information itself is actually useless, even though we learn a lot, because it could be very high spread, but it's all sort of really low utility, right? I don't care if this particular design is mediocre or terrible, if I already know that it's not the best. So I could reduce the spread on that, but it's not actually very useful. So high uncertainty, you could very easily learn useless information. Optimistic, the blue one, is actually quite useful in practice. The intuition is you either find a good solution because the true utility in that location is near the upper confidence bound, or you've pruned the design space. So this part is not optimal because I learned a lot and I collapsed the uncertainty. So optimistic is actually a good solution. Highest from sample is also a good strategy. It turns out it turns out to be very similar in behavior to the optimistic one in expectation. It's just a randomized algorithm. So both of those two, bottom two, actually can be quite useful. And they're known in the literature, if you're not familiar. The blue one's called the upper confidence bound algorithm. The purple one's called posterior sampling or Thompson sampling. And these algorithms, UCB and posterior sampling, are very well understood in classic settings with convergence guarantees and it being deployed in various applications. The types of applications that they've been successfully deployed in tend to be relatively simple, using relatively simple models, probabilistic models or Bayesian models, such as Gaussian processes, being applied to relatively low dimensional design spaces with relatively simple objectives, like just find the single best outcome. And all of this is sort of built on the fact that we have calibrated uncertainty. So our Gaussian process provides a calibrated uncertainty and a calibrated Bayesian prior of what we might expect. And then we use that, we build up from that to sort of have convergence guarantees, clean algorithms, and usefulness in certain applications. And so one example of such a simple application, at least in terms of the way I framed simple, is this application I worked on about 6-7 years ago now on treating lower spine injuries. So this is a person on the bottom right is a paraplegic, and my colleague Joe Burdick and our former postdoc Yana implanted this Medtronic epidural electrostimulator inside the spinal column near the spinal cord, and it induces electromagnetic field to help this patient be able to stand or walk even sometimes of their own power. And of course, we tune this to every individual patient whose injury is unique. So every new patient is a new experiment that's you can think of as out of distribution. And these methods actually work. Of course, there was not a lot of domain knowledge built into this design space. This is a subject that had been paralyzed for 2 years and standing for the first time with the help of this device. Of course, these domains were heavily constrained using domain knowledge so that the action space was pruned already using a lot of domain knowledge. So it was a relatively low dimensional problem. So for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about how we can move towards building, modeling higher dimensional problems using learned representations, using deep learning with uncertainty quantification, and how do we actually design these sort of algorithms for complex decision-making processes where the goal is not just to find the single best outcome. And let's start with the first part of the talk, which is the majority of this talk. And so this first research direction is, how do we combine representation learning with uncertainty quantification in a way that tries to check off as many of the boxes as I described in the opening of this talk. And so there's going to be this interplay between uncertainty quantification and experiment design that we want to understand in the context of using deep learning to learn these representations, and how do we design simple and scalable algorithms for making decisions built on top of these representations. And as you recall, the goal is to find the optimal design. So we're going to keep the goal to be a simple one, just to find the single best design. We're going to make that more complex in the second part of the talk. Now, we're going to use deep learning for the modeling, and uncertainty quantification, and the design problem that we're going to look at are always going to be out of distribution with respect to the prior data. And so one of the first ideas that we looked at when studying this direction was, of course, deep kernel learning. It's a natural starting point if a lot of this prior work was built on top of Gaussian processes. What deep kernel learning does is it essentially uses a neural net to translate from your input representation of whatever it is you're modeling into an embedding. And then this embedding is associated with a metric space, typically. And so you could build a kernel on top of it, like a standard kernel. So instead of building your Gaussian process on the native space, you build it on top of this embedding that has been processed by a deep neural network. That's essentially what deep kernel learning is. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually learn this deep kernel, this neural net, from scratch online during the experiment design, because because this new experiment is out of distribution, and we want to see if we can just learn the deep kernel from scratch. An alternative to doing deep kernel learning and to being Bayesian completely is to be frequentist. And this idea is just, it's very similar to the Bayesian setting, but we're just going to be frequentist whenever possible instead of being Bayesian. And the most basic way of doing this is to do bootstrapping and ensembles. So if your original data you've collected, so the original training data in the beginning, of course, might be 0. You haven't collected any data, and you start collecting a little bit of data at a time. At any iteration in the experiment design process, I have our current training data, and I simply bootstrap, right? I create a few different versions of my training data, I train my neural nets, and then each of my neural nets, of course, is initialized randomly, and it predicts a portfolio of predictions. And I could treat this as an empirical distribution of predictions, and I could do uncertainty quantification reasoning with this empirical distribution. So mechanically, it looks very similar to being Bayesian, except that everything is just frequentist. And so, yes?
Could you say a little bit more, what does bootstrap mean in this context? For those that smart?
Oh, so bootstrapping essentially means you take your training data and you sample it with replacement. Yeah, it was invented by Brad Efron a long time ago. And it basically gives you a randomized version of your training set that in expectation looks like your original training set.
Right. And the difference, when you say frequentist versus Bayesian, the only major difference is that we're not starting off with a prior. Is that the idea?
Your prior is bootstrapping. Or excuse me, I see. So in the maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but basically you want to be able to compute either an upper confidence bound or to do Thompson sampling where you choose a random sample. In the Bayesian's case, you have a full posterior, so you could just do that. In the frequentist case, you can do that as well. You have you can take the 99th percentile if you have 100 ensembles. In your 100 neural nets in your ensemble, or you can do Thompson sampling by choosing one neural net at random. So that's what I mean by mechanically. The mechanics of the algorithm, the policy that uses either UCB or posterior sampling looks mechanically the same. It's just the interior is, the Bayesian model is replaced by a frequentist ensemble. So because we wanted to actually run these experiments in the wet lab, synthesizing actual proteins in a new campaign, protein design campaign, we wanted to make sure which of these algorithms actually had the properties that we wanted before we actually invested in a months-long protein design campaign. And so one thing that Jason did in preparation for that protein design campaign was to do a bunch of calibration studies on pre-existing protein data sets. And so what you see here is, I believe, 8 trials of a simulated set of experiment designs. And what we're plotting is the calibration plot. So the x-axis of each of these plots is the expected confidence. And the y-axis is the empirical proportion correct. So for example, if the confidence of a point is 60%, is 0.6, you would expect that 0.6 of the time, 60% of the time, the actual regression target, the actual utility would fall under this value. But instead, in this case, it was 95%. So this yellow line is, in this case, underconfident. And perfect calibrated confidence would be this dotted black line. This is on out of distribution in this. Jason could correct me if I'm wrong. This is on out of distribution in the sense that you have your training set that you've collected in some way, not IID, and then you have a new test point. But it's on the same protein design family in this case. Like, for example, GB1.
It is within the same family.
It's within the same family, but the distribution is not sampled IID. Yeah. Yes? So GB1, there are 2 protein families that we have exhaustive combinatorial landscapes for, which means that we've basically tried all 160,000 variations if it's 4-site, and all we didn't try all 3.2 million for the 5-site, right? No, we have multiple 4-site libraries where we had all 160,000 mutations synthesized. One of them is GB1, another one's called TRIP-B, which was done in the Arnold lab recently. And so from that, from these two protein families, you can simulate anything you want, at least for measuring the calibration, for example, of these algorithms. One thing you notice is that, well, a normal Gaussian process has horrible calibration here, just completely awful calibration, at least in most cases. The deep kernel learning also quite bad calibration. It tends to be underconfident. The Gaussian process tends to be overconfident. And I'll get to you 1 second. And it turns out, and I'm going to ignore the blue boosty ensemble for the purposes of this talk. It turns out that the frequentist ensemble of deep neural nets ended up being the most calibrated on average across many, many experiments that we ran. Yes, question. Why do I think that? So, I should mention that we also tried this with a number of different representations. So the Gaussian, all of these kernels are built on some kind of metric space, right? And so the metric space could be the output of a protein language model like ESM. The metric space could be a one-hot encoding of the protein, just like, 1 of 20 for this location, 1 of 20 for this location, 1 of 20 for this location. When you have a protein language model as your input representations, the Gaussian processes work a little bit better. When it's one-hot, they're terrible.
Are these all using the same compute? Like, in what sense are these apples to apples versus to pairs? Well, like you're saying, there's different representations. So, like, how do I know which model?
Yeah. Let me
Yeah, I'll just mention that each column there is one representation, and they increase in dimension from left to right. So the leftmost column is it's only 4 dimensions, and the rightmost column is ESM2, which is 1,280 dimensions.
And like, what's the kernel and the GP?
It's an RVF. We deliberately did not try to over-optimize the kernel.
Except in the deep kernel learning, then you.
Well, it's not over-optimized in the sense that we didn't put a lot of manual.
Yeah. But that's inside of a GP, right?
It's supporting a GP. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. And so this is just a different view of the same type of experiment, where what you see on the left-hand side here is basically on this. If you look at this bottom row, it's the area under the area between the calibration curve and the dashed line. So lower is better, and so you get these kind of experiments results where again we have we see that these frequentist ensembles tend to be the most calibrated by a significant amount in these types of experiments. And so if you recall, this was our motivating application, which Jason spent a lot of time thinking about, where you have this protoglobin, and we want to optimize. We want to optimize these 5 sites on the active site, these 5 locations on the active site for this protoglobin, to increase selectivity for increase yield, for the cis product and decrease yield for the trans product. And there are 3.2 million variants in this design task. And so we did based on our simulation results, we chose to use frequentist deep neural net ensembles, and we did it with posterior sampling. So every round, we would train a bunch of neural nets. We would select one at random, and then use that one as the sampled fitness function, and then use that to help select the next set of experiments. These were done in batches of 96 experiments. That's the batch size of the experimentation, and there were 3 rounds of experiments. Well, the initial round was just random, and this is actually a very challenging design task because there's quite a bit of epistasis, and standard direct elution is ineffective in this particular case. And you can see that after round 2, we actually find some proteins that really optimize for our design task. Yes?
How many things were in the ensemble, and then you had to adapt these kind of acquisition functions to do batch, right?
Yeah. So I'm brushing that under the rug. Good. Which Jennifer won't let me. Okay, good. So for this particular experiment, we just did the top 96. Yeah, we just took one and just took the top 96. There are variations you can do, which we decided not to because this particular project had both the computational side of it and the actual chemistry side of it. And in order to sort of spend focus on the chemistry side, we kept the computational side as simple as possible. Alternatives that you could do is for each sample in the batch, you could draw a new sample of your posterior sampling, independent sample, and then you could optimize for that one, and that's parallelizable. We didn't do that here, but I'll talk about that later as a sort of an algorithm you can do later in this talk.
You mean you took top 96 from a posterior sample?
From one posterior, yeah, for this one.
How do you find the 96?
You do a for loop. So
It's a discrete space.
yeah, it's a discrete. There's 3.2. Yeah. There's 3.2 million.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you grow the proteins in a bacteria over a period of weeks, and then you choose your next 96, and it's a for loop over all 3.2 million. Yeah.
How correlated do those end up being if you're not accounting for?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And of course, if we were to do this again and we had the budget, and this is a really long experiment, so I think I would prefer to draw independent samples to see if it would do better. Of course, it's a really expensive experiment to run in the wet lab, but it's an interesting question. Just due to various constraints, we weren't able to explore that question fully.
Our computational simulations did suggest that the acquisition function did not significantly affect the outcomes of the campaigns. We tried things like QEI as well, which is conditioned on samples that are already drawn in the batch.
Thank you.
As an aside, we also experimented with many representations, and we found that using these protein embeddings like ESM2, they didn't really help this type of outer distribution design. And so we ended up just using one hot for the actual experiment, collaboration with Elogen. Okay, well, I'll have to admit, when Jason first presented those results to me, I was a little bit bummed out because I was really hoping that deep kernel learning, this online deep kernel learning, would show better performance because it's something that, at least to me, seems quite mathematically elegant. So let's revisit deep kernel learning. Now, if we want to be fully Bayesian in the context of doing this deep kernel learning plus a Gaussian process, you actually want to maintain a prior over your deep kernel. And then the Gaussian process on top of the deep kernel would be, the Gaussian process condition on the deep kernel you found. Given new data that we collected, as we're running our experiments, we would then compute our posterior over the deep kernel, and then compute a posterior of our Gaussian process condition on the deep kernel and the data. In normal deep kernel learning, which was the first thing we tried, this posterior over the deep kernel was just a point estimate. You just train your neural net weights, compute this one deep kernel, and you call it a day. And now the question is, can we be fully Bayesian and compute a true posterior over our deep kernel? And so that's a project that's ongoing. It's almost done. The key challenge is actually, as you might have guessed, computing this posterior. And so that essentially means I want to, if I have a prior over the deep kernel, for us, it's a prior over the neural net weights, and then a posterior over the deep kernel is the posterior of the neural net weights condition on the data. And essentially, we looked at two different options for computing this posterior. One is stochastic variational inference, which is very fast, but it turns out quite inaccurate in capturing the posterior. And the other one is MCMC, which is slow but much, much more accurate. And so here's some preliminary results on synthetic data in terms of Bayesian finding the best possible design. Lower is better. And the thing that you see is that stochastic variational inference can sometimes do quite poorly, whereas the Bayesian deep kernel learning with MCMC is reliably very good, sometimes much better than the alternatives. And of course, this is just on synthetic data sets. We haven't scaled this yet to the larger data sets. One of the key challenges in doing all this was that the implementation of the MCMC algorithm for this sort of Bayesian deep kernel learning plus GP was highly non-trivial. And Chris Ye, who is here today, as a PhD student, spent an enormous amount of time getting that implementation working, and we will release the implementation soon.
Yisong, what is the regret with respect to?
The global optimum.
So that's the neural net with the weights set in some sort of.
No, that's the single prediction with the best. The global optimum is independent of the neural net. It's the best design.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so story so far. Calibration is hard. One other thing that I want to highlight is that, which some of you may have already realized, is that computing this value of information requires extra reasoning on top of uncertainty quantification, right? You either need, if you want to compute the optimistic estimate, like the upper confidence bound, you have to do a little bit of reasoning on top of querying your uncertainties. And so, as we transition to the latter parts of this talk, one of the questions I really want to focus on is how do we compute this value of information at scale? Or in some cases, sidestep it altogether. And this can help us scale better in terms of computational costs and in terms of better statistical calibration with less data or using prior data even in the presence of domain shift. So I see that my animation is, just ignore that update policy. So we have so I want to give two asides in relation to these points. One is whether we can directly learn the value of information. So imagine that we had prior experiments that were exhaustive for their design domain. We can simulate a policy to design a sequence of experiments because we have this prior data that's exhaustive. And that simulated policy gives us this trajectory of experiments, measurements, experiments, measurements, experiments, measurements, and so on and so forth. From that, we can actually post hoc measure the value of information of each of these experiments. And that creates training data of the following form, where the input is all the previous experiments and measurements and the current experiment. And then the regression target is the value of information of this current measurement, if we were to take the measurement. Fit that in a neural net for a value of information model, give this value of information model to a policy, and the policy makes decisions according to selecting the experiment, xi, that maximizes the value of information. So now we've sidestepped doing uncertainty quantification explicitly. We've just directly tried to learn the value of information. There's a key insight to making this work, which is that most value of information functions look submodular, which is a technical term for it looks like it has diminishing returns. And you have to do a special trick to regularize these VOI models to look like a submodular function to get this to generalize well. This is work by Aya Aliva, who was a undergrad at Caltech, now is a PhD student at Stanford. And this is just one set of preliminary results that we had. This is in collaboration with Steve Mayo's group at Caltech. This is a relatively simple experiment, just a proof of concept. And here we're looking at the propensity for a protein binding to break apart, which is a KD, which is a common metric used in antibodies design. And the value information model here was trained on one antibody task, pre-trained, and it was just used on a new task. So here is an example where we are able to do some amount of out-of-distribution generalization, although, of course, more experiments are needed to see if this kind of approach can be used in a broader and larger scale. Aside number 2 is decision-aware uncertainty calibration. So if you look at high-dimensional UQ problems, you're trying to sort of do uncertainty quantification in this really high dimensional space, which can be quite hard. And one question you might sort of ask is, well, okay, do I really need to focus all that capacity, that learning capacity, on parts of the UQ space that are irrelevant for my downstream decisions? And so here we're going to study this particular question, at least initially, in the context of conformal prediction, which I'm not going to go into in detail. It's just another way of doing uncertainty quantification. But basically, a neural net predicts a conformally calibrated, makes a set of conformally calibrated predictions that's fed into some policy that's making uncertainty-aware decisions. You simulate and deploy this policy, and you get some reward. And then what you do is you backprop. You backprop through the decision-making policy, which can be implemented using what's called an optimization layer. You backprop through the conformal calibration, and then you backprop the weights of the neural net. And this is work by Chris Yue, who is in the audience, and Nico Christensen, who is another PhD student at Caltech. And here's just some preliminary results. The reason I'm not really highlighting this is it's slightly off theme. Just want to mention is a direction that we've started exploring. The motivating application was a sustainability application in battery storage in electric grids. And what you see here is on the top, the task law. So you take the same type of conformal prediction sets, either a box set, an ellipsoid, or an input convex neural net, which can be arbitrarily convex uncertainty sets. And this end-to-end optimization focuses the capacity of the neural net to do uncertainty calibration around the decisions that matter. And you see that very clearly as you increase the capacity of the neural net's predictions. The two-step is simply doing, first I do UQ, then I take this UQ model that was trained independent of the usage context, and I feed that into a decision-making policy. And then if you look at coverage on the bottom, the dotted black line is the target coverage under different confidence thresholds. For example, I want my UQ to predict an uncertainty set that has 95% coverage or 90% coverage. And the dotted black line is the target coverage. And then you can see that these methods still maintain that target coverage. So this is, again, still preliminary results, but it speaks to the fact that for these high-dimensional problems, it may be beneficial to actually focus the learning of the uncertainty quantification towards the areas that actually are relevant for the downstream decisions. So I have about 15 minutes left. The last part of the talk, and feel free to interrupt me if there are any questions, is shorter than the first part. And it's motivated by this application in computational antibody design, where we have an orchestrator algorithm that is basically a algorithm that can call other algorithms. In this case, just for the sake of an example, imagine that we had a cloud server, a cloud of Rosetta simulators, maybe hundreds or thousands, and we have an orchestrated algorithm that's choosing how to assign the simulation to be run in each of these worker nodes, and then its job is to make the best use of its computational resources and come up with, in this case, a portfolio of antibodies that optimizes for some proxy of a downstream task. So for example, I may want the antibodies portfolio to be diverse in the types of antigens that they hit, which is a proxy for a downstream task. Now, what we have is a complex objective. We're not trying to optimize for the single one best design, the single one best antibody. We're trying to, in the example I just showed, we're trying to optimize for the best portfolio. Other examples include, just beyond necessarily protein design, things like shortest path, top K, which is the top portfolio, a level set, everything above a certain threshold value, or a multi-objective Pareto frontier. These are all complex objectives that are more than just designing and finding a single design in our design space. Computational protein design setting is, I would say it falls in the category of top K or a very similar type of objective. So this setup can be captured using a problem setting called Bayesian algorithm execution. In classic algorithm execution, which is the following: You have your true model, which is expensive to, for the sake of this argument, let's say it's expensive to query. You have your base algorithm, which is a classic algorithm that's querying the true model for values, and then it outputs, whatever it's supposed to output. So for example, in the most iconic case, if we're computing shortest path, the true model is a graph with costs on edges, and you query that graph for the costs on edges, and you output a shortest path. In Bayesian algorithm execution, we acknowledge that the true model is expensive to query. So we have a probabilistic model over what the true model could be. We have an experiment design or orchestrator algorithm that uses the base model as a subroutine. And that it, from the probabilistic reasoning and understanding what the base model wants to output at the end, it queries the true model selectively. The base model by itself might query the true model many, many, many times. It queries the true model selectively, and then eventually generates an output. If you're interested in this overall setup, so the Bayesian algorithm execution setting was first proposed by Willie Neinsmenger, who was a postdoc at Stanford with Stefano Ehrman, now faculty at USC. He proposed it. This is the basic setup. I like this setup a lot because I think it captures a lot of the complexity in building these large-scale experiment design orchestration algorithms. And so we're going to use this framing to sort of develop some new approaches, which I'll present in the last 5 to 10 minutes. In this complex setting where the goal is not just to find the single best design, let's revisit what it means to compute the value of information. Recall that the informal definition of the value of information is how much information in expectation a measurement tells us about our desired goal. And here, we need to quantify the value of information for the best output of the base algorithm, informally speaking. Now, you can do this. You can extend the definition of value of information to quantify the output of the best shortest path or the best top K portfolio. But it turns out that that direct formulation is intractable. It's this really nasty integral. And so that motivated us to design a new algorithm. So this is work primarily by Cloris and Raul. Raul is in the back. He's here today. Raul is a postdoc with me, and Cloris is an undergrad. And we call it, the title of the project is Practical Bayesian Algorithmic Execution via Posterior Sampling. And I'll illustrate the algorithm with a picture. And the picture is an application in finding a level set in a 1D design space. So the x-axis is your 1D design space. The y-axis is your utility function. Actually, I have it animated. There we go. So the black line is the true model that is expensive to query. The dotted horizontal line is the threshold. So our goal is to find the level set, to find everything in the 1D design space that's above the dotted threshold. Given our measurements, of which we have made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measurements, we have our posterior. So the blue line is the posterior mean. The purple line is a sample function. And the level set on the sampled function, on the purple line, the level set on the sampled purple line function is your gray. So you compute the gray, the region on the bottom, which is the level set of the sampled function, but running your base algorithm on the purple line, which is cheap to compute. And then what the orchestrator algorithm does is it looks at all the points in these gray regions and computes the posterior uncertainty, which is the size of the uncertainty, and it chooses the point that has the highest uncertainty within the gray region. So that's the algorithm by picture. What are some of the benefits of this algorithm, which we call PS-BACS? It's very computationally efficient. You don't need to compute any nasty integrals. And here are some runtime comparisons with an algorithm with the first approach for this setting called InfoBACS, which has to compute an approximation of this nasty integral. And even that approximation is quite expensive. So this algorithm is between 20 to 400 times faster than InfoBACS. It's straightforward to implement, embarrassingly parallelizable. And we also have convergence guarantees. It's asymptotically consistent. And I'll just run through a few quick experiments. This is the level set experiments where higher is better. Our algorithm, PS-BAX, is in blue. We perform a little bit better. You can say comparable to InfoBAX, but we're about 400 times faster to compute. In local optimization experiments, where the base algorithm is doing some local optimization, we're better than InfoBAX and about 20 times faster. The reason why we're better than InfoBAX in some of these cases is because InfoBAX is making an uncontrolled approximation to the nasty integral, which is sometimes good and sometimes not so good. Shortest path, we're about the same, 20 times faster to compute. And then we also looked at this DiscoBAX setting, which is this drug discovery application proposed in this paper down below. It's based on this data set from Project Achilles. The idea is to choose K, in this case, K equals 10, interventions to optimize for the best reward. These are, and so the setting is fairly standard. There is a reference function that we know, and then there's a bias term that we don't know, that we can only measure in an experiment. And we want to find a portfolio such that of 10, such that one of the 10 is as good as possible. And so again, our algorithm at PS-BAX is in blue. And this setting is actually, if you actually look at the utility function and try to compute the value of information on this utility function, which is the best of a set of 10, it's actually quite nasty to compute. And so the approximation to the nasty integral is actually not very accurate. And we're also about 30 times faster to compute than InfoBAX. So I'm quite excited by these findings. These are very complex design tasks. They're much richer than finding a single best design. And we're starting to make progress and look at algorithms that can truly scale, at least somewhat, to these more complex settings. And so I'll close. I think I've about 5 minutes for questions. Summary of findings: calibration is hard. I think it's important to have collaborations with real domain experts on real applications because it really grounds your research. We're making progress on scaling to complex settings. And I think it's possible, in some cases, very beneficial to focus our uncertainty quantification capacity on the parts of the decision space that are relevant for downstream decisions. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, especially the students and postdocs in the top row who did all the work. This work was also funded or supported through experimental support by Elogen, Lawrence Livermore, and the DOE. And these are the papers. As you see, it's a very new talk. A lot of these papers aren't even on arXiv yet, but I'm happy to share details, and the students and postdocs are here today as well. Thank you for your attention. Yes.
Let's try to use the mic for this person.
I may have missed it, but how did you ensure diversity of points in that last example where you're saying you need 10 different experiments? So how did you enforce
So diversity is implicit in the objective. The objective is, of this set of 10, I only care about the max of this set of 10. I don't know what the max is because, as you know, in these drug design experiments, you have your reference model and then you have this bias term that's hard to model. And so I have some distribution over this bias term, posterior distribution. I choose a set of 10 so that collectively the max is maximized. And that implicitly means I want diversity.
Okay. Yeah, I was in the small molecule area, it would be cool if you could have different, structure types. And that would be something. So do you think you could do that, somehow enforce that in that setting? Because I think if it's implicit, that might be difficult, but.
So one of the motivating applications for us, so let me not answer your question, then answer your question. And I'll explain, it'll become clear why I'm doing that. The motivating application for us is something like, we don't know what the real side effects are. We don't know what the real efficacy is based on various environmental factors or whatever. So we want to just find this portfolio of, let's say, 10 to 50 antibody so that when we actually test them downstream in the wet lab, at least one of them is going to be good. Right? That's our motivation. And so there, the notion of diversity is, well defined in a mathematical sense, in that there's some variation in the things that we can't model, and then we want to maximize our portfolio. It's a standard way of doing investments, right? Like stock portfolio investments. The similar kind of argument. And so in that case, diversity is a consequence of maximizing that objective. If you explicitly enforce diversity, there's two reasons why you might want to do that. Well, really only one. The reason why you want to do that, broadly speaking, is because you don't know how to write down an objective function where diversity falls out as a consequence. So you want to explicitly enforce it. You can do that, and we have done projects where we've done that. My preference as an AI researcher is to find an objective where it falls out as a consequence. But of course, we've also had collaborations where we've done that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I was curious, one thing I found when trying to use any sort of Bayesian neural network approach to doing Bayesian optimization is often because a neural network, unlike a classical GP, will extrapolate that your uncertainty quantification or your acquisition function ends up being just dominated by the posterior. So even if you do upper confidence bound, the point with the highest upper confidence is just the point where the neural network has extrapolated the most, and it kind of ruins your uncertainty estimation. And I was just curious if you've come across this or if you have thoughts on how to overcome
we have come across this many times. So that was one of the motivations for doing this Bayesian deep kernel learning, actually. That was one of the key motivations.
Really nice talk. Thank you. When you did the bootstrap to train the deep nets, did you do just like the full-on conventional training a zillion times with sampling with replacement, basically? Like
yeah, I believe so. I mean, Jason can speak to that, but I believe he just retrained it. I mean, I will say one thing, which is one thing that is perhaps a little bit lost in the survey of applications is the relative cost between how much compute budget the policy has and how expensive the experiment is. In that wet lab experiment, it is expensive.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just
you can train as much as you want.
Yeah.
Well, but the reason I ask actually is there's something I've always been curious about, which is, okay, comparing the bootstrap to the much less principled thing that people do all the time, which is just use a bunch of different random seeds. You would never expect that to be well calibrated, but that's kind of what I've always been curious, like if you did a proper bootstrap versus
We've done that as well. Yeah, that also works pretty well.
Does that wind up being calibrated in a similar way?
Jason, can you answer that?
I didn't directly check the calibration on that one, but the reason I did bootstrapping was because for boosting, it's more deterministic, so I ended up using that for just to make it both of them have bootstrapping. Yeah.
We could check that. That one's something we can check actually fairly easily. I think so.
Yeah, I would expect it to be similar to Calibration.
That one's easy to check. We can do that.
It's just something I've always wondered, right?
Deep ensembles tend to pretty consistently underestimate uncertainty, in my experience. So I feel like if you don't do the bootstrapping, you get pretty uncalibrated uncertainties. N equals 1.
Hey, Yisong, thank you for the great talk. I just had a question on the convergence guarantees for these active learning design points. Are they on the actual information of information criteria on the design points, or achieving the maximum utility?
They are so right. So the one sentence summary, I realize I'm over time, is the following: all of these base algorithms, given unlimited access to the true model, they output a target set. The target set could be a singleton if it's just a maximizer. The target set could be a level set. So what we mean by asymptotic consistency is that in the limit of infinite queries to the true model, even though we're being more selective than just applying the base model directly, we will converge to the same target set.
Thank you.
Thank you. So one thing I didn't hear you mention is the scale of the experiments that's possible. And I'm wondering, when you have orders of magnitude of experimental scale to play with, if that would change the recommendation that you would give.
You mean that some experiments are a lot cheaper than others?
Yeah, some experiments you might be able to test dozens of designs, others you
Yes.
could test millions.
Yes. It's a great point. And so really great point. We've looked at this in an earlier context where we didn't use deep learning. So for example, in this multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization setting where you have really cheap experiments and really expensive experiments, we were able to design algorithms that can actually efficiently make use of cost-weighted value of information. Now, we weren't able to successfully yet apply the same idea with deep kernel learning and these other more advanced algorithms. Marrying the two ideas, I think, is an interesting direction for future work. I'm happy to give a talk on stuff like this. I just figured this new work was more interesting.
I think I missed it, probably what you said, but when you were directly learning the value of information, well, I guess two questions. Like you would specify something like, I essentially want to learn the value like of a particular chosen acquisition function in a sense without having ever measured the uncertainty. Is that
Yeah, that's right.
right? And
Yeah.
then, so I guess one question was, I don't recall what the upshot was. Like, can you do that? And then the other question is just like, from a theoretical level, this seems kind of dramatically unwise. And so I'm curious, like, do you have some
Yes,
intuitive or
yes.
theoretical rationale?
Great. So when we just did this and we did not regularize the model to be submodular, it was terrible. It was terrible. When we regularized the model to be submodular, it worked much better. So that's number one. Can't really say that that's a theoretical explanation, but as you know,
It works better than not doing that, or it works,
yeah, much,
but
much,
not better than standard approaches that include uncertainty quantification.
So it depends. So that's a really good point. I don't remember all the baselines we compared against in this experiment. I'll have to look at the paper again to see if what all the baselines are we compared against in this experiment. I will say one thing is that I'll say two things. Okay, as you know, a lot of this work has parallels to how people design algorithms in reinforcement learning. You can have a policy, and then you could have a value function, and you can have all sorts of mixtures of the two to come up with your actual algorithm. This is like directly learning a value function as opposed to coming up with a policy. And I don't know that I would advocate for this approach in a real experiment, like scientific experiment right now. I do think it's interesting. And and in this experiment, it was able to do some interesting distribution transfer. So as we look at larger and larger computational design experiments, like, I'm running Rosetta and AlphaFold and all these other and MD simulations in order to come up with something to propose for the wet lab, you can see how this approach might have a role to play in that larger system. But I don't know that I would advocate for this as like the single thing to do if you were to collaborate with a scientist today. Yeah.
Did you get your two things in? I didn't count. Because I was gonna just.
I said two things.
Okay.
One is
Okay,
the connection to reinforcement learning,
okay.
and the other one is everything else I said.
And then just a minor
Yeah.
clarification
Yeah.
question: like, which function precisely is submodular? Like, can you just like fully use English language for me to understand which function?
Your policy takes as input your historical data, I'll call it S, and X, and it outputs a value of information. Historical data is all the previous X and Y's. And if I have S and S prime, or S is a subset of S prime, holding everything else fixed, then pi of S X must be greater than or equal to pi of S prime X. That is the definition of submodularity.
So like intuitively, I think what it's saying is like, if I tell you more information, you better. What is actually what it now? I thought I had it. Like, can you also just give me an English version?
Yeah. Okay, sure. Sorry. So this is the amount of data that I've collected so far, right? This is the value of a new data point. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible. So modular basically means this curve looks like this.
But you're saying that if I give you more background data, then the value of information will be more?
No, if I give you less.
If I give you less background in, oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that was just, okay.
Yeah. So you want, I shouldn't call this pi, I should call this V, excuse me. So you're training V regression style, where this is the input and then there's some regression target, which is your post hoc calculated value of information. So that's just regression. And then you regularize it to satisfy this. And the intuition is this.
Basically, you're saying if I give you less information, you can derive more value.
Yep. So it imposes some regularity. So you have a few point estimates here, right, from your trajectory, and it's high dimensional. And then you impose a regularity condition based on this.
Okay. No, thank you so much. Okay, now we're over time.
Okay.
So you can grab Yisong when we close off. So it will reconvene at 3:30 for the last talk of the day before the reception at 4:30. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Yisong.
Thanks.